There are books that change the world, and then there are books that change you. Not instantly, not obviously, but slowly and deliberately, reshaping thought, memory, even identity. This one had no title, no author, and no recorded language. It wasn't catalogued in any library or mentioned in any archive. It was discovered by accident, buried beneath the remains of a monastery abandoned after a fire over 400 years ago. Most of the structure had been reduced to rubble. Statues had melted into warped stone, the ceilings collapsed, and what little survived was covered in soot. But beneath the altar, sealed in a chamber untouched by the flames, was a single room. Inside, a chair, a desk, and the book. The book hadn't burned. It hadn't aged. It sat in the center of the desk without dust, without wear, without explanation. Its cover wasn't leather, nor parchment, nor any material anyone could name. It felt cool to the touch, impossibly smooth, like skin stretched too tight over bone. Even insects avoided it. It gave off no scent, no energy. It was as if it existed just outside the rules of the physical world, an object not made but placed. The man who found it didn't open it at first. He assumed it was a replica, a stage piece left behind by some previous excavation team. But when he tried to lift it, it wouldn't move. Only when he placed both palms flat against the cover and whispered, "What are you?" did it release, lifting free as if responding to his voice. Inside, every page was blank. Hundreds of perfect white leaves, smooth and untouched. No title page, no markings, no signs of age. Just emptiness. He turned page after page in silence, expecting at any moment for ink to reveal itself, hidden by time or trick. But nothing appeared. Still, he couldn't bring himself to leave it behind. He carried it with him, ignoring protocol and instinct, telling no one. For weeks, it sat untouched on his desk, silent, inert, patient. Until one night, while reaching across the table, he cut his palm on the edge of a cracked drawer. A smear of blood fell across the corner of the book. The next morning, a sentence was waiting for him on the first page. It was written in ink as black as shadow, dry to the touch, as if it had always been there. The letters were unfamiliar, yet he understood them instinctively, as though the message had been formed, not with language, but with meaning. It read, "We've been waiting for your voice." He stared at it for hours, not because he was frightened, not yet, but because it was impossible. He remembered the pages clearly. He had flipped through them dozens of times. There was no text. There had never been text. The next day, with trembling hands, he pricked his finger and let another drop fall onto the page. Another sentence formed slowly, as if being written from beneath the paper. "What will you offer for another page?" It wasn't a response. It was a question, an invitation, a transaction. He no longer thought of it as a book. Books don't ask, they don't wait, they don't feed. He began to search for any reference to it, in grimoires, forbidden texts, occult journals. Nothing. No record of a book that writes back in blood. No hint of the monastery's secret vault, not even a passing mention in religious heresies. Whatever this object was, it existed outside of documented history. And now that it had been touched, acknowledged, awakened, it refused to be forgotten. It didn't feel old. It felt eternal, like something that had been waiting, not buried, not hidden, but sealed. And now, it had a reader, and it wasn't going back to sleep. The next few days passed in a haze, not of fear, but of obsession. He couldn't stop staring at the book. The way the ink appeared, dry and deliberate, without fading in or soaking through the paper. It was as if the words had always existed, buried just beneath the surface, waiting for the right key to unlock them. And that key, it seemed, was blood. Nothing else worked. He tried ink, charcoal, even sacred oils. but the pages remained blank. Only when his blood touched the parchment did the book respond. Always with a sentence. Always in that same quiet voice, asking instead of answering. He began cutting himself deliberately. Not deep, just enough. A drop here, a smear there. At first, he waited days between offerings, afraid of what it might cost. But the more the book responded, the harder it was to resist. The sentences that appeared weren't random. They were specific, personal. They asked about his childhood, his regrets, his deepest doubts, and the worst part, they knew things he'd never said aloud. It didn't answer his questions. It asked him, "Do you remember what you did at the lake? Why didn't you stop her from leaving? Would you trade pain for memory?" It wasn't testing him. It was peeling him apart. He started to lose time, minutes, then hours. He'd sit at the desk, offer blood, and find himself staring at a new page, unable to remember the moment the sentence appeared. Sometimes, entire entries were already written when he woke up. Paragraphs, dialogues. One night he found a conversation written out across 10 pages, his words and another voice going back and forth. But he didn't remember writing any of it, and the handwriting matched his. That was when the dreams began. He'd wake in cold sweat, heart pounding, the scent of parchment and iron thick in the room. Sometimes he dreamed of the monastery, not as it was now, but as it had once been. Lit candles, chanting monks, a book glowing on an altar. Other times, he dreamt he was writing. But the hand holding the quill wasn't his, and the words on the page made no sense until he woke up and found the exact same lines inside the book. It was learning from him, feeding off him, not just physically but spiritually, and it was changing. The sentences grew longer, more complex. They stopped asking questions and started giving commands. Write the name. Remember the face. Offer what you took. The book no longer needed an invitation. It began responding before he opened it, sensing his thoughts, anticipating his questions. Sometimes, a new line would appear as his hand hovered over the cover, as if it had already written what he was going to ask. It knew him too well. It wasn't reading his mind, it was inside it. But the worst moment came late one night when he tried to resist. He had bandaged his hands, locked the book in a drawer, sworn to himself that he'd stop, just for a while, just to clear his head. But he couldn't sleep. The air felt charged, metallic, heavy. And then he saw it. The book was sitting on the desk again, untouched, unopened, with a fresh line written across its page. "You bled for less than this." He hadn't even touched it. He hadn't even been in the same room. But it knew. It called to his guilt, his curiosity, his longing to understand. He told himself it was hallucination, that the stress was getting to him, that sleep deprivation was warping his perception. But then he noticed something else. The cuts on his fingers were healing faster, too fast. He began to feel moments of euphoria after each session, like the pain released something trapped in him. Like the book wasn't just taking, it was giving. Clarity, insight, even luck. His decisions felt sharper, his instincts more accurate. He started seeing patterns in everyday life, symbols in buildings, faces in clouds, sentences overheard on trains that matched what the book had written the day before. It had connected itself to him. But connection, in the language of magic, is never neutral. It either binds or claims, and the book had no intention of being shared. By the third week, he no longer approached the book with questions. It didn't matter what he wanted to know. The book had no interest in being interrogated. It had its own rhythm, its own path, its own conversation. Every time he tried to steer it towards something specific, a historical mystery, a spiritual theory, even something personal like a memory he couldn't place, The response was the same. Silence, or worse, misdirection. The book wasn't there to give answers. It was there to uncover something. And whatever that something was, it lived deep inside him. It began asking more invasive things. Not just about his past, but about his beliefs, his fears, his guilt. One morning, he woke to find 3 sentences waiting. When did you first lie to yourself? Would you choose truth if it left you alone? What version of you deserves to remain? They weren't just questions, they were decisions. And the more he read them, the more he found his thoughts reshaping around them. He'd sit for hours, trying to answer honestly, but every response left him feeling hollow, as if the words were being pulled from somewhere he hadn't meant to reach. Somewhere deeper than memory. Soon, the book began predicting his behavior. It would write instructions hours before he carried them out. On one page it read, "You'll leave the door unlocked tonight." And despite checking it 3 times, he woke up to find it ajar. Another day it wrote, "You'll speak a lie before noon and believe it." He didn't remember lying, but later, when a colleague asked if he was okay, he smiled and said yes, and he meant it. But it wasn't the truth. That was when he realized the book had started shaping his reality, not through suggestion, but through observation so precise it might as well have been writing the world itself. Like it was recording ahead of time. Not prophecy, not prediction, construction. Somewhere in the process, he stopped recognizing his own handwriting. It still resembled his script, but not quite. There was a tilt he didn't remember, a rhythm that felt unfamiliar. It was as if another version of him, deeper, older, more fractured, was answering when he wasn't looking. And then, one night, after a longer bleeding ritual, the writing changed entirely. It became a dialogue. He'd find pages filled with back-and-forth exchanges. He'd read lines that began in his voice, but ended in a tone colder, more patient. The other voice was calm. It never argued. It simply asked. And with every answer, it pushed further. Would you give memory to keep peace? If pain was the price of knowing, how much have you already spent? Who are you when no one's watching? And do you deserve to continue? By this point, he was no longer just feeding the book. He was bound to it. His sleep deteriorated. He stopped answering calls. He withdrew from friends, colleagues, his work, not out of fear, but focus. Because he was convinced now that the book wasn't speaking to him randomly. It had chosen him, and whatever test it was running, he wanted to pass. But there were rules he didn't understand. Some days, the book remained blank no matter how much blood he gave. Other days, it responded before he'd even thought of a question. And once, after trying to trick it by copying one of its old entries into a new page, the entire book went black. Every page, as if ink had flooded through the paper. It took 3 days before the pages turned white again, and when they did, a single phrase remained on the final sheet. Do not mimic what you do not yet understand. It wasn't a warning. It was a reminder. The book wasn't teaching him. It was measuring him, testing his intentions, testing his willingness, seeing how far he'd go and whether he'd go without needing reward. That's when it began showing him things, not in dreams, in waking moments, flickers in mirrors, flashes at the edge of sight, symbols carved into walls that hadn't been there the day before, faces in crowds that stared too long. He stopped feeling alone, even in empty rooms. And worse, he stopped minding. The book had become more than a presence. It was a mirror, a confessional, a force that didn't want belief. It wanted surrender, not just of body, but identity. And slowly, he found himself wondering less about what the book was, and more about what it was turning him into. He no longer remembered what day it was. Not just the date, the concept. Hours blurred, meals went uneaten, mirrors became unreliable. There were stretches of time where he could recall writing something, but not what it meant. Other moments where the book had written something true, and he couldn't remember ever living it. The disorientation began slowly. At first, it was small things. He'd misplace objects. He'd reread entries and find phrases he was sure weren't there the day before. Then came the gaps. Entire pages of his journal had been filled in with handwriting that resembled his own, but carried a colder edge. Notes written in third person. Phrases like, "He is almost ready," and "He still thinks the voice is separate." He didn't remember writing them, but they were there, signed with his name. The deeper he went, the more familiar the book began to feel. Not as an object, but as an extension. Like a limb he had simply forgotten was his. He stopped needing to bleed. The book responded to thought alone now, and yet it still demanded attention. If left alone for too long, it would whisper, not in words, but in sensations. A tug in the stomach, a pressure behind the eyes, the taste of ash on his tongue. It was as if the book had become a nervous system of its own, plugged into his. And the world around him began to thin. He'd walk through his apartment and feel like the walls were farther away than they should be. The corners of rooms would shift subtly when he wasn't looking. Time moved differently when the book was open. 1 hour felt like 5 minutes. 5 minutes felt like days. When he looked at photos of himself, from weeks ago, even days, he didn't recognize his own face. Something in the eyes had changed, a vacancy, or maybe a fullness. Like someone else was now watching from behind them. Worse still, other people noticed. When he left his apartment, rarely now, strangers would hesitate before meeting his gaze. He noticed how people shifted away from him on buses, how shopkeepers offered his change without making contact. A neighbor, normally cheerful, flinched when she saw him in the hallway and dropped her keys. She apologized, but her voice trembled. He didn't ask why. He already knew. The book was changing him, not through commands, through proximity. It no longer needed to ask questions. He had become the question, the center of something it had been waiting to unfold. And yet, as his connection deepened, something else slipped further away. His memory. He'd find notes he didn't remember writing. Objects in his apartment that weren't his. A coat he'd never worn, hanging in the closet. A key to a door he didn't recognize. And then there were the reflections. Sometimes when passing a mirror, his image would pause, just for a moment. Not long enough to confirm, but just long enough to doubt. Long enough to wonder if the person looking back had blinked. Too late. He started hearing footsteps in the hallway when no one was home. Whispers that didn't come from the book. Shadows would stretch longer than they should. Sometimes the lights would flicker when he turned a page. And each time he felt on the edge of panic, the book would offer a new sentence, calm, precise, and always devastating. You were never only one. He'd sit in silence after reading those words, unsure what to feel. Afraid, yes, but also relieved. Like a weight had been acknowledged. Like something inside him had always known, and the book was merely confirming what he was too afraid to ask aloud. He had stopped thinking of himself as a person reading a cursed object. He began to suspect that he was the object. That the book hadn't just chosen him, it had remembered him. And now it was restoring what had been lost. But at what cost? There comes a moment in every encounter with the book when the pages stop responding. Not out of silence, but finality. After weeks, sometimes months, of communion, of bleeding, of unraveling, the sentences stop asking. The ink no longer dances, no longer reshapes memory or whispers identity into the dark. It simply delivers one final message. Now write what you owe. No further instruction, no explanation. Just those 5 words, written in a script more refined than before, darker than ink, almost embossed into the page. A sentence that feels less like a request and more like a demand made long ago, now returning to be fulfilled. He didn't know what it meant at first. No one ever does. Some interpret it as a metaphor, a call to confess, to reflect, to let the book hold the final weight of their story. They write apologies, regrets, prayers. Some write nothing, believing silence to be the most honest answer. But that's not what the book is asking for. It's not looking for closure. It's looking for claim, for completion. And the moment you touch pen to page, the moment you begin to write what you believe you owe, the book writes with you. Only what appears isn't what you wrote. He tried to pen a memory, a final act of agency. But the letters bent beneath the ink. They curved into new shapes. They spiraled out of grammar and into something deeper. Glyphs that pulsed on the page, symbols that seemed to breathe. He couldn't stop his hand. The book pulled the words from him like marrow, and the ink didn't dry. It sank, as if the page were drinking it. The more he wrote, the less he felt. Cold spread through his limbs. Sounds became muffled, like he was sinking underwater. Somewhere in the distance, a voice, his own, was still speaking, still writing, but his mind had slipped free. He was no longer at the desk, no longer in the room. He was inside the pages. That's what the book collects. Not stories, not spells, people. Each reader becomes a layer, a voice in the ink, a perspective woven into the weight of the object. And when the next one finds it, the book doesn't just ask questions. It speaks with you. The voices that guide, manipulate, test. They belong to those who came before. That's why the final line is always the same. Now write what you owe. Because you're not just finishing a story, you're becoming part of it. Some copies of the book are said to have resurfaced, always in abandoned places, places marked by death or silence, found by people who feel inexplicably drawn to them. Artists, scholars, dreamers, all of them believing they've discovered something forgotten. All of them vanishing soon after. No signs of struggle, just a book left open on a desk. And the last sentence written in fresh, glistening ink. Now write what you owe. If you've heard your own voice in this story, if a part of it felt too familiar, you're not alone. Stories like this are warnings disguised as whispers. If something ever speaks back when you read, don't answer. And if you do, tell me what it said. Leave a comment, like this video, and subscribe for more forbidden stories from the places you were never meant to look. Because the next time you open something that should be blank, it might already have your name written inside.